Good evening. I'm Sandy Dallenberg, and I've been offered the chance to have myself introduced, and I'll not do that. I'm a fallen law school dean, a fallen university president, and a person who's damn proud to be here at this law school on this occasion. I wanted to start off by just a couple of comments. We Americans are proud people, and we're proud of being the land of the free and the home of the brave. And yet it strikes me that this brave people allows itself to be intimidated year after year by scare tactics, among them scare tactics that have led us into a disastrous public policy with our criminal justice system and with our prison system. We're the home of the free, and yet we lock up more of our citizens than any other country in the Western civilization. The conference we're about to listen to, the seminar we're about to listen to, is a follow-up on some really important work that's been done over the last few years and going back some period of time. There are a couple of people I'd like to introduce who are in the audience. I won't try to introduce everybody who deserves that introduction, but I work for Dean Rasmussen, and he's in the back and so he makes sure that I get paid for my university work. I want to make sure I don't neglect him. And where's Fred Gaines? Fred is former president of Florida A&M, a great friend and a great colleague. And during the time that Fred was at A&M, I must say publicly, as I've said to him so many times privately, I just treasured the relationship we had and cooperation we had on so very many things. Okay. The land of the free and the home of the brave. How did that change? I believe we can go back to a period of time back in the 1970s. Nixon announced his war on crime, and shortly following that, Governor Rockefeller, who had, we believe, national ambitions, announced a draconian program in New York. It was 40 years ago, January of 1973, that Governor Rockefeller announced this program to have stiff sentences for crimes, including nonviolent crimes. And that movement quickly spread to other states. Came to Florida. I'm delighted to say it came to Florida after I'd served in the legislature, so I plead not guilty to most of the nonsense that we're trying to correct today. But I have no doubt that had such a program been offered to the legislature in which I served, we've been bulldozed in the same way that legislators were bulldozed with essentially fear tactics about this runaway war on crime. Happily, some people with good sense are moving to correct that. And we're seeing quite an incredible array of people. I must say, as a avowedly liberal Democrat, I must say largely Republicans, Grover Norquist and others, who are pointing out that public policy that's led us to this vast expenditure on a prison system that is simply dysfunctional is a crazy policy, and it's one that needs to be corrected. Now, my sole job here was to get you settled in your seats and to introduce Allison DeFore. Is Allison working somewhere here? Is he actually in his station? Incredible. Well, Allison DeFore, I must say my very good friend, he's not a liberal Democrat. A former public defender, a former prosecutor, a former judge, a former sheriff, a former candidate for lieutenant governor on the Republican ticket, a person who simply cannot hold a job, but a person who continues to think about public policy, is a student of Florida history, and happily a student of our criminal justice system. And he has been the moving force behind this whole program. Allison, I'm proud to know you as a friend.
As well.
And I ask people now to welcome Allison DeFore.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you very much. Thank you. I finally found a job I think I can keep, maybe forever. Thank you, Sandy, and without Sandy's help, we wouldn't be standing here. He was so staunch. He and Dean David Rasmussen, who's on our board, and we've got other board members, Richard Doran, former Attorney General of Florida, Fred Gaines, former president of Florida A&M University, Jim Murdaugh is, if he's not here, he's on his way. From TCC, Jeff Kronschnabel from St. Petersburg College. We've put together a really unusual consortium here at the Project on Accountable Justice at the Institute of Government at Florida State. It's a consortium of TCC, St. Petersburg College, Baylor University, interestingly, Byron Johnson, whose books and work in pro-social behavior have been really pivotal, and we've put together something that's aimed at looking at evidence-based outcomes and results in criminal justice. Fundamentally, we want to try and be Switzerland because we think that at the end of the day, some of the trends that have gone through hospitals and education are getting ready to go through criminal justice. 30 years ago, if you'd have gone onto a high school campus or a hospital and said, show me your outcome results, they'd have said, where's your subpoena? And if you didn't have one, they'd have said, you're leaving under escort immediately. And now that kind of information is commonly available. There may have been bumps in the road, but at the end of the day, the information is there and people compete with it, and that's a big deal. It hasn't even started in criminal justice, and we think it's coming, and we'd like to help make it happen to the extent that we can. Towards that end, St. Petersburg College is one of our partners. This is their forum, and we welcome them. I think this may be the first college forum by a member of the college system in Tallahassee, by non-local college that I'm aware of in my lifetime. And so that's kind of interesting unto and of itself. And we welcome David Clement, who is the director of their Public Policy Institute, and Bill Law is one of the members of our board. And we welcome them here. And we welcome particularly our friends from Georgia who have come down to share with us their experience, strength, and hope, and see what they've been doing up there. The relationship between Florida and Georgia is an interesting one, always a rivalry. The game that we have in Jacksonville every year epitomizes it. The best quote I've heard for it is the quote in when the census came out, when Governor Talmadge was governor of Georgia. It appeared that a quarter of Georgia had picked up and moved to Florida in the teens and 20s, beginning of the boom. That's when my own dad's family came down as part of the Great Georgia Diaspora, and they went to Governor Talmadge at a particularly potentially embarrassing moment, and they said, Governor, how can you account for the fact that a quarter of your state has moved to Florida? And he said, I don't know, but it's raising the IQ of both states. And so some of that tension we hope to capitalize upon here today in a happy and positive way, and we welcome our friends from Georgia who will be introduced in just a moment. With that, my job is to introduce Bob McClure, who is the CEO and president of the James Madison Institute, our partner here. There are some fundamentally deep conservative values about what's going on here, which is why when Eric Holder presented his speech to the ABA a couple of weeks ago, and they went to the Head on Right on Crime, his response was, well, we're glad he showed up to the battle. We've been here for a couple of years. The right has made a strong push in this area for a lot of different reasons, fiscal accountability being one of them, but also over-criminalization and also just fundamental what's right. And so I'm proud to be here as a conservative, as Sandy's proud to be here as a liberal, and we got a lot in common on these issues, and glad to do it. Bob has been the CEO of the James Madison Institute for the past 10 years. The Institute itself is 25 years old and is such a well-known bastion of freedom and particularly free markets that I don't think they need much more introduction beyond that. He is a good fellow, he's well-rounded, and he's very, very good on public policy, and we are privileged to have him as a partner in this, and for me to introduce him and ask him to come up and take it from here.
Thank you, Allison, for the introduction. Sandy, it's good to see you. Hadn't seen you in a little while. You're looking fabulous. Thanks for all you're doing, and I appreciate it. Sandy described himself as a liberal Democrat. Allison described himself as a conservative Republican. The James Madison Institute's been described as the evil empire. And so I take that moniker proudly, But I ask you to look around the room. I think it's fascinating who's here and why you're here. Elected officials, staffers from the Capitol, professors here at Florida State, men and women who believe passionately in this issue. As I did an interview previously right before we began, this is an issue that cuts across all kinds of political ideology. Not only does it make economic sense, it makes moral sense. And I think it's fascinating that as we look around the room and you look who's in here, my guess is we probably, if we went into the voting booth, wouldn't all vote the same way, but that's just a guess. So thank you all for taking time out of your night to be here. I think we're all going to learn a lot from our esteemed guests from Georgia. We can't wait to hear from them. And it's going to be fascinating. It really is. The goal really for Florida as we study criminal justice reform is really threefold. We want to reduce crime. We want to protect and restore victims and their families' rights. We want to, when appropriate, reform the offenders, make them productive citizens of this great state and of this great country, all while lowering costs. Currently, criminal justice is the third largest budget in the line item in the state's budget and continues to grow unchecked. It's almost much like forms of health care, the Pac-Man of the state budget, and it's an issue we need to focus on. There's no doubt, however, that we can learn from other states. Florida is unique, as I always say, with deference to our good friends from Georgia. We like to say really that what you have in the state of Florida is the entire country demographically. What you have in the state of Florida, rural and urban and growth and Hispanic and African American and the history of this state, you have the entire country right here. So if we can get public policy right in Florida and learn from our good friends just up the road, it has national implications because the entire country is watching our state, and I think that's important. I also think the nation, given the makeup of this room, as we talk to people nationally, the diverse makeup of this room, these kinds of events are happening all across the country. So we're at a tipping point, if you will, as a nation to address this very important issue. For years, we've heard about the successes of states like Texas in cutting crime and cutting costs through re-engineering their criminal and juvenile justice systems. It's time for Florida to do the same. And we're fortunate tonight to hear of Georgia's effort in this policy arena. And we're pleased to have these three distinguished panelists with us tonight. I'd like to introduce them each individually, and then we will begin the program. Thomas Worthy, Deputy Executive Counsel in the Office of Georgia Governor Nathan Deal, is with us tonight. Thomas graduated with degrees in politics and sociology from Washington and Lee University. After serving 2 years on the staff of the late Georgia Congressman Charlie Norwood, Thomas graduated from the University of Virginia Law School in 2010. He practiced law in Alabama before returning home to join Governor Deal's in-house legal staff in 2011 as Public Safety Policy Advisor. He was promoted to Deputy Executive Counsel in 2012. He served as co-chair of the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform for Georgians in 2012, and now serves as co-chair of the statutorily created Georgia Council on Criminal Justice Reform. We also have with us Judge Michael P. Boggs, Court of Appeals, the great state of Georgia. Judge Boggs was appointed to the Court of Appeals in 2012 and was elected statewide to serve a 6-year term beginning in 2013. Prior to his appointment, though, he served as Superior Court Judge for the 6th County Waycross Judicial Court Circuit. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science and psychology from Georgia Southern College in 1985 and his JD degree from Mercer University's Walter F. Georgia School of Law in 1990. He practiced property insurance defense litigation, and in 2000, Judge Boggs was elected as state representative to the General Assembly, where he served on the Judiciary, Public Safety, and Government Affairs committees. Among his legislative accomplishments, Judge Boggs authored the Child Protection Act. He served as a member of the Governor's Judicial Nominating Commission and a member of Georgia's Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform. Representative Jay Neal, Georgia House of Representatives. As Vice Chair of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee, Representative Neal was asked to carry agency legislation for the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. During his freshman year in 2004, he did so and quickly became the go-to House member for GBI legislation. That same year, he authored legislation that reduced the number of meth labs in Georgia by 65% in the first year. Representative Neal has previously served on the Children and Youth Committee, including as chair of the Study Committee and the Economic Development and Tourism Committees as well. In 2011, Representative Neal authored HB 265, establishing the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform for Georgians, which has led to criminal justice reform for adults and juveniles. And finally, Representative Neal has shared the story of criminal justice reform in Georgia with numerous states and conferences over the last 2 years. And before I turn it over to them, I want to thank both FSU's Project on Accountable Justice and St. Pete College. We're honored to partner with you. Thanks again. We're going to begin. Each will have about 10 minutes, and then we'll have about a 10 to 15 kind of time for them to finalize their thoughts, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Gentlemen, Mr. Worthy?
Thank you, Dr. McClure. Thank you to each one of you for being here. We are certainly excited to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about 2 years of reforms, 3 major legislative bills of which we are all very, very proud in Georgia. I am not going to take my full 10 minutes. I am, in fact, going to allow these 2 gentlemen to my right to take most of my time because I think that they will provide you with a lot more of the substantive information that you came to hear tonight. My role in this process as co-chair is really kind of more of the trains on time type of guy, and make sure all the scheduling is being met and all the reports are going out and all the data is being collected. But I do want to take this opportunity at the outset to share a little bit about Governor Deal's vision and why we got where we are today. He was running for governor back in 2010, and he was inaugurated in January of 2011. And during his campaign, and right as he took office, he began looking at the numbers. And certainly these reforms that we're here to speak to you about are good public safety policy, good fiscal policy, and there's certainly a moral imperative part of them as well. But they started by looking at the numbers. In Georgia, we have about 55,000 inmates in our Department of Corrections, about 10 million people in Georgia. So our population and our prison population are exactly half of yours down here in Florida. However, we have the exact same number of people on probation as you do. It costs about $18,000 a year to house one inmate in one of our state correctional facilities. And we know that we have about a 30% recidivism rate. So we know that everybody leaving prison, 1/3 of them are going to come back into their communities and commit crimes. And we knew that that is not good public safety policy. And in fact, that was not doing anything to create safe communities. So after looking at all these figures, the governor really kind of put everybody on a guiding principle of we need to cull the population and determine those who have committed something so heinous that we are afraid of them as society, and those that we are just mad at. And that is the task that he put before us, and that really led us to where we are today. With that, Dr. McClure, I'd like to call an audible up here and send it to Representative Neal first, because I think that he would fit in more on the timeline of kind of how the council came to inception.
Thank you, Thomas. It is an honor to be with you. I had the opportunity last year to come and speak in Orlando a little bit about my story and about Georgia's criminal justice reform story. And I am convinced that the reason I am in the state legislature is to address the addiction, recovery, criminal justice reform issues. And I say that because my background prior to running for state representative, I was a pastor. I worked in the community, drove a school bus, worked in the school system, very actively involved in the community, saw a lot of issues within the community related to addiction and the impact that addiction had on families. In my family, I had never seen addiction. Within my family, we didn't have that to deal with. And as a pastor and working within the community, my only experience with addiction was trying to help people basically overcome the neglect, overcome the issues and the challenges that their families were facing as a result of the addicted parent that was not taking care of their family, not taking care of their responsibilities, not working a job. And as a pastor, I was trying to help those families through those situations, and quite frankly, had one of those attitudes that's a very common attitude in this country, especially in the southeastern part of the country, and that is these addicts, these alcoholics that are not able to take care of their families, they're continuing to be a drain on society. They're continuing to abuse their drug of choice and neglect their families. And if they don't think enough of their families to straighten up and take care of themselves, then maybe we need to get their attention. Maybe we need to help them understand the problems that are facing their families. And I, like many others, felt like that punishment was the way to do that. We did a great job in Georgia over the last couple of decades punishing people. Many of those people that we punished were people that were not criminally minded, but instead, as Thomas talked about, we were just mad at them. They weren't criminally minded people. They were behaving criminally as a result of their addiction. And our response to them was that we were going to lock them up. We did a great job of that for a long time. That's the reason our prison population doubled from 1990. When the federal government thought it was a good idea to go to 3 strikes, you're out, Georgia said, well, if you think 3 strikes and you're out is good, what about 2 strikes? So Georgia did 2 strikes and you're out back in the mid-1990s. And as I was running as a conservative Republican, running against a Democratic incumbent that had been in office for a long time, in spite of the fact that Georgia had been going down that road of incarceration for decades, part of my campaign was about creating greater public safety, and that being interpreted was we're going to make sure that people serve their time. If they can't live within society the way they should, then we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we make them. We'll teach them that they've made their bed, let them lie in it. That's kind of where I was when I went into the legislature. I never had any political aspirations. I was recruited to run, and as a pastor, all I agreed to do, when they asked me to run, all I agreed to do was pray about it. And I felt, and my family felt, and my church felt that it was God's calling on me, and I decided to run. Very early, almost immediately, as I was elected, they mentioned the bill for dealing with the meth epidemic that I introduced in my first session. That was part of a campaign promise where I really didn't have a personal interest in that, but the incumbent I was running against was making it a major part of his campaign, so I responded with laying out my plan for what I would do if I was elected. And then I got elected, so I started working on fulfilling my campaign promise, and I introduced legislation to deal with the meth epidemic. And in doing so, I was introduced to the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse and some other organizations and individuals that were working in the addiction field, the recovery field. And at the same time, there were a group of men in my community that were in a recovery residence and started attending my church. And what I saw in those men who were attending my church was completely different than everything I had believed about addicts up until that point. I saw them crying, and I saw them broken. And I saw them when I talked with them about their family, when I talked with them about their spouse and about their children, they were torn up by the way they had failed their families. And they wanted more than anything else to be that husband, that father that their wife needed, that father that their children needed. And no matter how much they wanted to, they just couldn't seem to get over their addiction. And I found myself in a position to where everything that I had believed about addiction up until that point was 180 degrees from what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, and I didn't know how to reconcile my experiences now with everything that I had grown up believing. The Georgia Council on Substance Abuse offered to send me to a conference on the science of addiction, and I agreed to go because I knew I needed to know more about addiction, because what I knew apparently wasn't accurate, it wasn't correct. And I began to learn about addiction, the science of addiction. I began to learn that while I had always viewed addiction as a moral issue, addiction wasn't such a moral issue after all. Choosing to introduce the drugs into their body was a moral choice, possibly. I'll give you that. But the way the brain reacted to the introduction of the substance was not a choice at all. Some people could drink a lot and not have any impact, or experiment and use recreational drugs and never have an impact, and others could take that first drink or that first hit and be addicted. So I took it on myself to learn more and more about addiction, and as I did, I grew convinced that the reason God had called me to run for state representative was to be an advocate and a voice for recovery. So I started working in recovery, organizing rallies at the Capitol, doing everything that I could to promote recovery, pushing the recovery agenda. And in 2010, I was invited to go to a Sentence and Corrections conference, and I was introduced to evidence-based sentencing and corrections. And the science is very clear. The data is there that if you treat offenders based on their risk needs assessment appropriately, you're going to get good outcomes. If you treat them inappropriately, you're going to get bad outcomes. And you can take people that don't need incarcerated. They just need a little bit of help in the community, a little treatment, a little supervision in the community, need a hand up, and incarcerate them and let them spend 2 or 3 years, and they come out of prison still addicted, but now they have a criminal mindset that they did not have prior to incarceration. That's a public safety hazard. We're taking people who would never hurt anybody other than themselves, teaching them to be a criminal, bringing them back out into the community to where now they're a threat to their neighbors, they're a threat to my family and to your family. That's a public safety hazard. So I began working on criminal justice reform. Governor Deal came into office, and one of the first things he did in an inauguration address was talked about criminal justice reform. And I was way up here because the stars were aligning, and the reason I felt like God had me in the General Assembly was now an issue that was important to the most important leaders of our state. We did a press conference that Allison talked about with the governor and the speaker and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general and the chief justice of the Supreme Court, key leaders of the state that came together and said, we've got to do something about our criminal justice system. We've got to begin handling our offenders differently, and we're going to create this Criminal Justice Reform Council to look at what we're doing in Georgia and what we need to do differently. And that began the path that Governor Deal has led us down for the last couple of years. And I just can't say enough about Governor Deal's leadership. I'm not one of those guys that's real starstruck, but let me tell you, when you start talking about Governor Deal and his leadership in the state of Georgia, I have some really warm feelings toward Governor Deal, and I put him on a pedestal as a hero for being willing to get out and do the right thing when there was some skepticism going in as to whether it was a politically good thing to do, politically right thing to do. And he had the courage to lead, and as we gathered the data and put together reform that was data-driven, and I think that's one of the most important things for us to remember, data-driven, consensus came around that policy. And over the last 2 years, we've passed 3 major pieces of legislation in the Georgia General Assembly. We have 236 legislators, and with those 6 votes altogether between the House and the Senate, there was one no vote on all, 5 of them passed unanimously. 5 of those votes were unanimous votes. 1 vote had 1 no. And I'm just proud to be a player in that and to be a part of that and to know that that when people come together around good data, working together to do the right thing can still be done. And I'm here to tell you that in Georgia, I'm convinced that we're doing the right thing in criminal justice reform. And thank you for the opportunity to come and share a little bit about our story. Now, I'm not going to, I don't know enough about your system to tell you what you need to do in Florida, and that's not my goal. But I will tell you what we've done in Georgia, and I'll tell you what I think is right about it. And I'll proudly stand up and talk to you about what we've done in Georgia. Thank you for letting me come.
It's hard to follow that act. Anytime you follow a preacher,
I could just keep going.
I don't mind. I'm honored to be with you as well. And thank you for the invitation. I serve as a judge on the Court of Appeals of Georgia, and I speak today. I'll preface my remarks with the fact that my comments today are in my capacity as Vice Chair of the Council on Criminal Justice Reform that I co-chair with Thomas Worthy of the Governor's Office. He and I have had the pleasure of co-chairing that council for 2 years. Last year with juvenile justice reform primarily, this year with the issue of reentry, which the governor has tasked us with addressing. And then I was on the council for the first year. So, you know, we have rules on public comments of judges and sitting judges in Georgia, and I'm very careful to comply with those rules and won't make any comments concerning public policy other than to just discuss with you kind of the outline of how we formed this council and what it was we were tasked with handling. Understand that in Georgia, 1 in 13 citizens is under some form of correctional control. That is, they are either in prison, on probation, or on parole. 1 in 13 leads the nation in that category. It's not a category that we're very proud of. That was one of the issues and one of the data drivers that drove the dialogue and the conversation of this Criminal Justice Reform Council. In addition, Georgia was expected and projected to experience 8% prison population growth over the next 5 years, which would get us from 2011, which would get us to about 60,000 inmates with a population of roughly 10 million people. That cost of 8% prison population growth was going to run roughly $264 million. Georgia's Corrections Department cost on average every year is budgeted $1.1 billion. I think the governor and others believed, correctly so, that Georgians were not receiving a very good public safety return on their investment. And those sorts of data drivers continue to engage legislators. I will tell you, we've had extraordinary leadership from the executive branch in our state. Governor Deal has led by example. He led from the beginning of his first term. He addressed some issues that, quite frankly, intuitively are not necessarily politically correct, particularly in a first term for a Republican governor. I applaud Representative Neal for his leadership. What we did was allow those data drivers to at least start the conversation, and then ultimately the governor, by the legislation that Representative Neal passed in his 2011, creating the council. We had 15 members of that council that were a cross-section of disciplines. The Chief Justice had 3 appointments. They were judges. I was one of those appointments and was a trial judge, a circuit court judge at that time. She likewise served in a very, very serious role and was very interested in these issues. The lieutenant governor, the speaker, and the governor had the other appointments. And we had DAs, we had law enforcement, we had public defenders, we had all of the right people at the table to at least begin a dialogue. I will tell you that notwithstanding that the bills passed unanimously, but for 1 nay vote, there was not unanimity among the council on the recommendations that we were going to make. We ultimately made, we had some serious conversations. They were all open to the public. We invited stakeholders. We listened to all of the people that had an interest in the outcomes that were going to be perceived from these recommendations. And in the first year, we looked at what other states were doing. We looked at what Texas was doing in the nature of criminal justice reform. Fortunately, they had implemented some of these reforms early enough ago that there were some results already coming in. that demonstrated the effectiveness of those reform efforts. First and foremost for the governor and for me, and I think I speak for all of the members of our council, public safety was the driving consideration. No one, Democrat, Republican, or otherwise, on these councils wanted to do anything that would harm public safety. And so with that and the data, our data, driving the conversation, we set out to decide whether there was a better way to address improving public safety. And we can talk later, Dr. McClure, about the specifics of our recommendations, but in general, we focused the first year on adult criminal justice reform. I ran a drug court in 4 of the 6 counties that I presided over as a circuit court judge, so I had some familiarity with adult felony drug courts, post-adjudication drug courts, and the governor, interestingly, had interest in those as well. And so we focused on accountability courts and focused on promulgating standards and a peer review process that would ensure that these programs were all operated in the same similar manner. And we focused on probation and strengthening probation to reduce recidivism and increase public safety. We focused on some governmental efficiency issues like electronic submission of sentencing packages from our sheriffs to the Department of Corrections to expedite the removal of inmates from county jails, which were quite expensive for our county taxpayers, and at some point expensive for the state as well, since they, after 15 days, took over that cost. So the council was made up of 15 members. We had dealt with criminal justice reform in the adult arena. The governor the next year extended our service by executive order, increased the size of our council from 15 members to 21 members. Thomas Worthy and I co-chaired that council, and we were tasked with addressing juvenile justice reform. That was a heavy lift. There were a lot of issues to address in juvenile justice reform in Georgia. And then ultimately, we made recommendations to the General Assembly. Again, not unanimity among the members of the council as to what we were going to recommend. But I think the General Assembly recognized that this council, with its inclusivity, its broad section of disciplines represented, was going to properly vet and appropriately, I think, approach these issues with a very deliberate and contemplative approach. It resulted, I think, in the building of some political capital among the members of the General Assembly, that what they were getting from the council was well vetted not only from a legislative and political perspective, but most importantly from a stakeholder's perspective. And that led us into building on that capital to get criminal justice reform for juveniles passed in the second year. And then this year, the governor we now have legislation creating this council, 5-year terms, and the governor has tasked us with addressing the issue of reentry. And we will, the governor calls it a 3-legged stool: juvenile justice, adult justice reform, and then reentry. And so catching them on the first end, on the way into the prison system, and now dealing with them on the way out. And we will, I guess, address issues like supportive housing, the efficiencies of transitional centers, how recidivism and public safety can be improved by providing services to inmates within the system before they get out, matching them up with substance abuse and mental health counseling services so that there is a continuum of services to these offenders, which quite frankly really drives back to the initial issue which drove most of the considerations in criminal justice reform, and that is in Georgia, I suspect in Florida too. 85% of the felony criminal conduct in Georgia, all 159 counties, is driven by a substance abuse problem. And you know that when you see a cocaine possession case, simple possession, or a cocaine with intent to distribute, or a trafficking case, or a methamphetamine case. Those are clearly drug-related cases. What's less obvious and not quite as intuitive for the general layperson is that most of our nonviolent property crimes, in Georgia at least, whether they be forgery, financial transaction, card fraud, theft by taking, those sorts of crimes are all drug-related as well. And we recognize that, and we recognize that by addressing the substance abuse and mental health side, we could, if you will, slow the faucet and maybe put some lives back together and put some fathers back with their children and put some people back in a family structure. And ultimately, we will see whether what we've done works. We've already seen some preliminary data. We would like to think that all of the good that comes out of criminal justice reform will be evident in the studies that are done subsequently. But recidivism, the most important study, is a 3-year look back in Georgia. And, it's too early to tell. But we do know what other states have experienced. So we're really excited about what Georgia's been able to do. I'll echo what Representative Neal said. you know, we don't have enough data, and we wouldn't presume to tell Florida how to do anything, or whether you should do anything, but we can certainly tell you how we kind of approach the issue and some of the recommendations we made. And again, I'm honored to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to move to this side so we can have a few concluding comments and then a couple of brief questions. Any concluding comments from any of the three of you all?
Sure. I made this comment to a group of sheriffs that we met with earlier today, but I believe that if my boss was here this evening, he would tell you that ever since he became governor, his number one goal has been to make Georgia the number one place in the country to do business. And there are signs by business-related magazines and articles that we are moving in that direction. But that's much more than tax incentives or tax credits or the availability of land or availability of workforce. That is school-to-prison pipeline. That is quality of education. And that very, very importantly is exactly what we're here to talk about. So, you know, criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, all of the reinvestments that we've tried to make directly impacts all aspects of state government.
Any further comments from either one of you? I'd like to begin with one question for each of you, then we'll open it up briefly. Representative Neal, you talked about the 6 votes for 3 pieces of legislation that were voted on in Georgia where there was only 1 no vote. Could you specifically talk about what those 3 individual pieces of legislation what each was and how they were applicable to the state of Georgia?
I can, let me give you some highlights on it. The first bill that we passed was House Bill 1176. That was in 2012. And House Bill 1176 did a number of things that were recommended by the council. Now, we didn't try to do everything the council recommended in that first year, although I would like for us to have done. I was that guy that was ready to try it all, but I think probably we did the right thing in holding me back and given something that we had that census, that we had the ability to get this kind of vote. But we created degrees of burglary, for example, prior to House Bill 1176. It didn't matter if you're stealing a lawnmower out of a yard or breaking into to a shed or coming into a residence. We had 1 sentencing range for burglary. So we broke that down into degrees. That should be an easy answer to know that there's a real difference in breaking into a shed behind a house and breaking into a dwelling. So we changed our sentencing guidelines based on the degrees of burglary. We increased the felony thresholds for theft and for forgery. We looked at it had been 500 for 30 years. It hadn't been adjusted for 30 years. We took it from 500 to 1,500 for the felony threshold. We did that in House Bill 1176. We also did a weight-based on cocaine. It didn't matter if you had 20 grams of cocaine or if you had dust on a straw. There was 1 sentencing guideline. We broke that down to where 0 to 1 was a smaller sentence, so we were able to get a little bit different sentencing guidelines or sentencing ranges on those drug charges. We also did some things with our accountability courts that Judge Boggs talked about, creating standards for drug courts so that we could have consistency across the state. We also set up a committee to approve and award the grant applications for those drug courts, accountability on the back end to make sure drug courts are doing what they were supposed to do. That was part of House Bill 1176. That's all I'm thinking of right now. That was the first vote. And that one was 162 to 0 in the House, and it was 51 to 0 in the Senate. That was 2012. In 2013, this past year, we started looking at the juvenile justice reform, and then we expanded upon our adult criminal justice reform, and we did a couple things. In the adult criminal justice reform, we addressed mandatory minimums under certain circumstances, giving judges the opportunity, the ability to deviate from those sentencing guidelines under certain circumstances. I think that was a pretty important step that we took. That was one of those steps that it was recommended in the first year. We felt like we needed to stay away from that. That was a part of our second year. We did some record restriction pieces in both years, actually, for making it a little bit easier for offenders who were either found not guilty or cases dismissed, or previously, if you had an arrest on your record, it was very, very, very difficult in Georgia to do anything about that arrest. So we facilitated that, made it a little bit easier to get those arrests off. And then on the juvenile justice, and by the way, that passed unanimously in the House and the Senate as well. No, that's the one that got one no vote in the Senate. And it was a senator, when I went up to him, I was there when the Senate voted. There was an amendment on that bill that there was some confusion about what the amendment actually did. He was a little confused about what we were doing, and he frankly told me, I just didn't think this bill went far enough, and that's the reason he voted no. The juvenile justice bill, I was not as involved in the juvenile justice. I was more involved in the adult, but juvenile justice broke down our 7 deadlies continue to be a grade 1 felony, but all the others broke down into a lesser grade that allows more flexibility, more discretion in the sentencing, and ultimately we created fiscal incentives as well for communities to handle their juveniles within their community rather than sending them off to our RDCs. And those were the 2 primary things that I remember from our juvenile justice. And that bill passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate.
Great. Thank you. Judge Boggs, you talked about a 3-legged stool. Could you amplify on exactly what you mean by that?
I think the governor recognized that he needed to build some political capital in the efforts at criminal justice reform. And you know, you can address criminal justice reform from a number of perspectives. You don't even have to do it quite frankly within the 4 corners of the criminal justice system. There are a lot of things that affect criminal conduct that are outside the 4 corners of the criminal justice system, and you can address criminal justice reform by improving high school graduation rates, quite frankly, in my opinion. You can do it by improving health care. You can do it by ensuring that people have jobs. In the end of the day, there are a lot of things that drive criminal conduct, but ultimately I think the governor felt that for the first year, the best way to address the issue was to address what I would consider to be low-hanging fruit, and that's some things that other states had experienced that quite frankly had proven beneficial. And so we addressed adult reform first, but those are people that are already in the system. They've already occasioned some cost on the communities through victimization cost and otherwise, and it's awful late in the system to be addressing folks once they get in the system. And so I think recognizing that, we went back and looked at juvenile justice reform. We rewrote our entire juvenile code, which had been a long time coming. We did the things that Representative Neal said, but the 3 hallmark pieces of our juvenile reform were basically 3 things. Number one, we did carve out Class A and B felonies for our Designated Felony Act. We had a Designated Felony Act that started in 1982, I believe, with 7 offenses, and through years and years of lobbying and efforts and otherwise, it morphed into 30 offenses, running the gamut from murder to smash and grab burglary, all with the same sentencing options for a judge. So the stratification, if you will, of the Designated Felony Act was important. It was also important that we had a lot of offenders being sent to prison as status offenders, which means that their only crime is missing school, for example, truancy. It's a crime by virtue of their status as a juvenile. We felt that, and the governor felt, and clearly the legislature felt, that there are some folks that ought not be sent to those facilities. We knew we were sending about 40% of all locked up juveniles to YDC youth detention campuses were low-risk, nonviolent offenders, but they came out. Those beds, by the way, in Georgia were costing us, Georgia taxpayers, about $90,000 per bed per year for one juvenile. And actually, you could roll a couple juveniles through that bed, but it's still, that bed is a $90,000 a year bed. Unfortunately, the recidivism rate we saw with youth for coming out of YDCs was 65%, re-adjudicated delinquent and back in the system within 3 years. And so what we did was we said that we're going to prohibit status offenders at all from being sent to these facilities, and we're going to prohibit misdemeanors after the third, unless it's after the third. And so, you know, the problem you get there is, okay, well, if you're not going to send them to a facility, where are you going to treat them? What are you going to do with them? And that's where the governor had the foresight to establish a voluntary fiscal incentive grant program where we basically say, Judge, when you're dealing with a disposition on this particular juvenile, we want to give you some options that you can develop in your community. And so we started with adult reform. We then went to juvenile justice reform, which is a little bit further back in the continuum. And now we're going to deal with what do we do with them when they get out. Because you ask any judge in your state, I suspect, or any person involved in law enforcement, and they'll tell you that they routinely deal with a lot of the same people. I sent some of the same people to prison more than once. I dealt with them on probation revocations, and I was a felony court judge, and so these are serious offenders. But I kept dealing with the same people, and it's a generational problem typically. And, you know, most of it's driven by substance abuse issues, which, you know, quite honestly, in the whole scheme of things, can be addressed. We have pharmacology, we have substance abuse technology, we have great techniques to deal with some of these mental health and substance abuse issues. And so it was very important that we address those issues as well. And so now we're going to deal with, hopefully, some reentry pieces that will prove very beneficial. And this isn't about saving money, it's about saving lives. And I think personally, the moral perspective ought to be driving the conversation more than any fiscal concerns. We're dealing with people's lives, we're dealing with putting people back together with their families, making productive citizens out of them, and we've recognized some deficiencies in our system that I think we can fix through building transition centers, ensuring that they have good substance abuse and mental health treatment services available to them, because most judges will tell you, you send somebody to a rehabilitation facility run by the Department of Corrections or anyone else, and they get out, and the failure is always the follow-up, the after-treatment, the aftercare piece of the puzzle is where the ball gets dropped. And so we need a better continuum of services there, and that's what we hope the reentry piece will provide.
Thank you. Final question, then we'll open it up to everybody. Valerie, I don't know who's going to be carrying the microphone around, but, oh, all right, great. Mr. Worthy, last question. We have some elected officials in the audience. Sure. Why would anyone risk their political future, not to be crass, to support this issue? And why is it not only, you know, not to be untoward, won't you simply be called soft on crime and lose your next election?
No, not at all. I personally, I believe that they wouldn't be risking their political futures at all. And I think that if you really drill down on the public safety numbers that I briefly touched on earlier, especially knowing what we know about recidivism and knowing that these criminals are going back into their community and committing their crimes, and us even knowing that they're going to do it and the state not being able to stop it, I think that is the definition of you know, a public safety hazard, as Representative Neal called it. In fact, I think that all of the reforms that were passed by Georgia are tough on crime. But the only difference is, instead of being broadly tough on crime, it is strategically tough on crime. And I think that these reforms, in fact, do make communities safer. And throughout this entire process, public safety has been held paramount by the governor, by the council, and by the General Assembly. I don't think that these can be painted as soft on crime at all. I think that what these are more appropriately labeled as is looking at it and being smart on crime.
Good. Were you going to say something real quick?
If I can, just
Sure.
real quick. I was primaried after House Bill 1176 from the right, which surprised an awful lot of people. And I was painted by my opponent as the big government candidate, which really surprised a lot of people. But he never criticized on criminal justice reform. I'm the one that talked about criminal justice reform. And the only time he talked about it was try to minimize my involvement in it. I don't know of anybody in our House or Senate that had opposition following these reforms that saw any small even indication that they were being attacked as a result of what we did. Everybody was supporting what we did. And one more thing to just go a little further with the tough on crime part. Judge Boggs was a drug court judge. I now, which surprises me as much as anybody else, but I now operate or a campus director for a residential drug treatment program. Would have never expected to do that 10 years ago. But we have guys who come through our program that are sent by drug courts. We've had more than one that's told us, you know what, I think I'm just going to go back to prison. Because drug court is not easy. We're not being soft on them when we put them in drug court. It is a very tough 2 years typically, where the accountability and the responsibility that we place on them is significant. And when people in the community realize that we can send them to prison where they cost us $48 a day, and the recidivism rate's 30-something%, and they're not doing anything at all to be productive, or we can leave them in a drug court where the cost is not even half the amount, the recidivism rate's 7 to 10%, and they're working a job and paying taxes while they're doing it, just about everybody says that's a good idea. It's not politically risky when you have all the data and all the information.
And at this point, I would be remiss to not point out that I think Georgia could have done it, but I think it would have taken us a lot longer to do it without the incredible technical assistance that we received from the Public Safety Performance Project at the Pew Center on the States, from the Vera Institute for Justice on the adult correction side of things, and the the Annie E. Casey Foundation on the juvenile justice side of things. And I think that we do a very good job of collecting data at DJJ and at our Department of Corrections, but the way in which our technical assistance providers extrapolated that data and put it out there for public consumption by the legislature, by the council, and by the general public, once you saw that, it was very, very hard to argue with the efforts that we were trying to make.
I hope that will be helpful to our elected officials in the room. Please give the entire group a round of applause and welcome for questions. We have a microphone going around the room. If you would raise your hand, if you're going to ask a question, a couple of stipulations. If you would say your name and the organization you're with, whether it's FSU or business or whomever, and please stick to asking a question, and let's move away from dissertations.
Thank you all. I really appreciate this. I'll say just first that Florida's threshold for felony theft is $300 still. So that's another thing to work out. But as far as the juvenile
Tell me your
justice,
name and who you're with.
apologize, Nathan Moon, I'm with the Office of the State Courts Administrator right here in
Great.
Tallahassee.
Thank you.
So I noticed in House Bill 242, it addresses a variety of things related to what I think you call transfer of juveniles to adult court. We call that direct file here in Florida. And Florida is among 2 states in the District of Columbia that has a process whereby the state attorney makes the sole discretion on whether a child is prosecuted as an adult. And obviously that leads to a lot more kids being dealt with in the adult criminal system at greater cost and at poorer results. Was that something that you all had to address with the process that you have in Georgia for transferring those juveniles?
I've just been elected as a judge. The short answer is yes. In Georgia, it's similar. The prosecuting attorney has a lot of discretion with respect to juveniles and whether they'll be charged and tried as adults. Fortunately, the judge has a role in that process as well. It's interesting that you're involved with the administrative office of the courts because they were very involved from our perspective in Georgia, particularly with regard to the promulgation of standards for mental health and drug courts. I don't know about Florida, but we didn't have standards. Every drug court judge kind of did their own thing and led to some outlier practices. And ultimately what we've ended up with now are promulgated standards, and you have to comply with those standards, evidence-based practices, in order to receive the grant funding that's available through the state. The governor put 11.7, I believe it was, $1 million in that grant fund last year, and I suspect there'll be a similar amount this year. But back to your point, yeah, I mean, the whole concept of what do we do with a juvenile offender was the driving consideration about the entirety of our juvenile justice reform efforts, because quite frankly, with 159 counties and with really a disparate socioeconomic class from really rural Georgia to metropolitan parts of the state, we had very few community resources. And these juveniles, we know, because there's plenty of data, you know, what would have worked for you as a juvenile and what worked for me as a juvenile, which is a threat of my father, who was a law enforcement agent, telling me that if I didn't get home on time, I couldn't use the car next weekend. That was enough. But we know that there's plenty of data in the United States that suggests that what you think would intuitively would work for these children doesn't work. Scared Straight programs, for example. And so we were really struggling with how do we build a system that allows judges options and not impose upon our communities an unfunded mandate by telling a county that doesn't have the resources to begin with to build an anger management program or an SA program or a mental health program. One of these programs that we know works, sex counseling programs for these juveniles. And so ultimately, the driver was how can we incentivize these communities to build these programs locally? And more importantly, how can we incentivize our judges to choose something other than, not just that it's a costly facility, but choosing something other than one of these costly beds where we know that the outcome is going to be poor. And it's all about building. In fact, I think the statistic is correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe our number in Georgia was that 95% of all youth that were sent to costly youth detention campuses came from, I believe it's 8 counties in Georgia of the 159. And so the idea is you fiscally incentivize those communities to build programs that work in the community, that are proven to work cognitively and otherwise. And we had grant money available for them, and we've incentivized them to do it. They've taken part. The RFP was led, and these folks are now have this money to build what we hope will be effective programming and ultimately improve public safety and ultimately keep these children out of the adult system, which is the real ultimate task and challenge. But ultimately, the question was, what do we do? What options do judges have when heretofore the options were either put them back in the same environment from where they came or to lock them up? And those were the only 2 options. And quite frankly, those are unacceptable options from a number of perspectives.
You want me to start? I'll take it. You got it? Oh, okay. You may take it away from me if I don't ask the right question. The question is to the judge. And first of all, I want to tell you that.
You might tell me name and.
Oh, yes, Ron Silver, former state senator and House member of the great state of Florida. And I'm uniquely qualified because I have 2 relatives that live in Georgia. Okay? But I want to tell you about Sandy Delabart first. When I was in elementary school, he was a representative that I looked up to, and that's why I got involved in politics and elementary school, and look at him now. Yeah, okay. I had the unique experience of chairing juvenile justice. We did a complete juvenile justice reform, criminal justice in both the House and the Senate, criminal justice appropriations, and healthcare and human services appropriations. I can go into a whole bunch of things, but what I'm interested in is you made a statement, Your Honor, about after these people leave prison, follow-up is very important. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that particular aspect of it.
Thank you, Senator, and welcome, and thank you for being here and for your public service. I will tell you that as a sentencing judge, where we traditionally see problems with offenders that have been incarcerated is that they go back to the same people, places, and things that got them in trouble to begin with. And that cycle, you know, listen, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. I mean, AA has been teaching that for decades, that you have to change your people, places, and things. And, you know, as simplistic as that sounds, there's a lot of truth in that. And what I found, and I think what other judges and what the system really breeds, is that we can do a fairly decent job in Georgia. We send folks, I would send them routinely to a residential substance abuse treatment program, an RSAT, and it's exactly what you think it is, except it's run by the Department of Corrections. And so as an alternative to placing somebody in prison or on probation, and if you didn't have a drug court or some other remedy available to treat mental health, co-occurring disorders, or some substance abuse issue, that's where you'd send them. In the past, those residential substance abuse treatment programs were a 9 to 12 month program in Georgia, but because of fiscal concerns, they have been cut like everything else in Florida too, I suspect, and now they're 6 month programs. And it exacerbates the problem that I alluded to in this way, and that is that I'm not a doctor, and I don't purport to understand the entirety of physiology, and particularly with respect to the effect of substance abuse on individuals. But I'll tell you that I've studied it a lot, and I've been trained a lot as a judge, and I have been told that to give significant impact and effect, that is to treat someone's significant substance abuse issue, you need 18 to 24 months of in-house treatment, and that's expensive. And so what the state did was we reduced it from 9 to 12 months to 6 months, which made the aftercare component even that much more important. What happens with these young kids that I dealt with was that they go to a facility for 28 days, or they're in jail for 30 days and detox the hard way, and they get out and think they're cured, and they think they're well, and they haven't been taught any coping techniques. They've not been taught any management techniques whatsoever about how to get away from their people, places, and things, and they violate again. It is inevitable, and it's a cycle that I saw routinely. And so what you do to try to break that is you send them whatever available means you have. My drug court was a 24-month program, and it was onerous. 3 hours, 3 times a week of substance abuse counseling. You had to get a job. You had to get your GED. You got drug tested at least 3 times a week. You had a curfew. It was a very, very onerous. Anybody that would argue to you that it's easier than probation has never studied it and doesn't know anything about it. Probation is a cakewalk compared to what a drug court program calls for. The problem with all of these systems is you can't have your eyes on them all the time, and you're not going to have your hooks in them all the time. Eventually, they're going to be on their own. It's like raising a child, right? And so you send them off to college, and you hope they've learned right and wrong, and they don't come back and live in your basement forever, right? So, ultimately, these folks would come back, and I'd send them to the basement again, and we'd keep that cycle up until we recognize that you have to have this aftercare program. And aftercare is this. Typically, it is a continuum of substance abuse and counseling services. It is management of your substance abuse or mental health issue from a pharmacology standpoint, and making sure that they know where to get their meds, and making sure they can afford their meds and they have transportation to get their meds. It's a continuum of services. And we find that the most successful offenders are successful at aftercare, and where their failure occurs is they do it for 2 or 3 months, and then their boyfriend or girlfriend gets back involved with them, or they get another enabler around them, and they end up falling away from what has gotten them sobriety for 24 months. And so you've got to be able to do that. And how do you do that? Well, I think you can use accountability courts as aftercare programs. We have community service boards in Georgia that provide the mental health service components to our citizens in our state, not just offenders. You have to be able to build a network, and in a state like Georgia, it's challenging because they're expensive and it's a lot of rural parts of the state. But aftercare is crucial. And if you ask any judge, they'll tell you that they're not going to recidivate while they're in behind bars. They're going to recidivate when they get out and they fall back into that same lifestyle, and that's why reentry is so important. Because reentry, we're dropping the ball on the mental health piece, which I think is an enormous piece that needs to be addressed. and I hope we'll see some movement in that regard as well. Thank you, Senator. It's a good question.
My name is Jim Clark. I'm a former Secretary of Social Services in South Carolina. I was an assistant secretary here in our Department of Children and Families, and for 12 years I headed up in our old Division of Youth Services, the Bureau of Research, Statistics, and Planning. So I'm familiar with many of the issues you've raised. When I look at Florida and I think of the legislators that are here, a thought that keeps coming to me is that 17% of our population is over 65, and they represent a third of the people that vote. And when I think of a legislator who comes from an area that has, and a lot of the elderly have an unreasonable fear of crime. Actually, the studies indicate that they're less susceptible to crime, but that doesn't matter. They fear it. And no legislature wants to run against somebody who's going to say that they're soft on crime. So my question really is, do you gentlemen have some strategies, some ideas that would assist our elected officials to overcome these kinds of fears that they have to be reelected?
Thank you for that question. I'll take a first crack at it, and then Representative Neal may be even more qualified to comment on that. But, you know, one of the successes that we found in Georgia was using this council process. In Georgia, we have a 40-day legislative session that starts the second Tuesday of January, and those 40 days usually stretch the session into March, April, or May, depending on how many legislative days are burned. And that is a pressure cooker of a 3 month. During that 3 months period, the whole building's a pressure cooker. And oftentimes, legislation is introduced in a very reactionary manner. And I think that the reason that we found such successes in these justice reform and reinvestment efforts is because of this council process. And I think that, as we mentioned earlier, the council represented a very, very broad array of stakeholders at every aspect of the justice delivery process, representing almost every political party and ideology. And with each success, that council got more credibility, it gained more momentum, and the conversations to build consensus were done in a very friendly and in good faith environment, rather than in a very quick-paced, high-pressure environment of the General Assembly. And I think that if you start talking about these issues at a very, very early stage in the game and building consensus before the legislature even takes it up, I think you can see some of the successes that we saw.
I agree 100%. And one thing that I'd add to that, the majority of seniors either have a child or a grandchild or a niece or a nephew that's a really good kid. Not like those criminals out there. A really good kid that was with the wrong people at the wrong time, and they got in trouble. And the majority of the seniors can sympathize with what they're doing, with what we're doing, when they see the face of their child or grandchild or niece or nephew when they're thinking about this criminal justice reform as well.
One quick thing.
Yeah.
The political exposure that is anticipated by criminal justice reform is overthought and not based on good data. It is driven by fear of being defeated. The data will drive the debate. I have never spoken about criminal justice reform in front of any organization where after you told the story, they didn't get it and they didn't support it. And the key and the challenge is, of course, dispelling the misinformation and resting on good data. And it has to be your data. It can't be data from Georgia or data from Texas or Ohio. It has to be your data. But I suspect your data will tell a very good story. And Representative Neal is right. I mean, I can't tell you the number of calls I got as a trial court judge, and I still get them. Got one today from a very dear friend whose niece, in this case stepdaughter, excuse me, has a substance abuse problem. He wants help. And everybody knows somebody, and it doesn't have to be in your family, but it can be in your extended family. And I think that issue would resonate very well with a crowd of citizens who have paid taxes and done the right thing for all of these years, and they want to support candidates that are smart on crime, and the data will prove that up, I think.
I think we'll take 2 more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have a two-part question. In all your deliberations, did you consider the value of restorative justice practices or victim impact programming within the system? Or have you thought about victims as one of the stakeholders in your system?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. In Georgia's executive branch, victims' compensation and the vast majority of the victim services is housed in the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, which is the CJCC, but there are also victim services at parole and corrections, and those stakeholders were parts of the conversation from the get-go. Absolutely, yes, ma'am.
One more question? Yep. If you'll identify your name and who you're with.
I'm Sergeant Barbara Weber out of Jacksonville, Florida. I have a question, or actually some advice I'd like to get from the judge. I will be some help, actually. We have some of the highest sentencing guidelines, you know, in our area, and it's hard for us to get, you know, incentives. I have a new cognitive-based, behavioral-based program that we are trying to implement in Jacksonville, T4C, Thinking for a Change. And I am going before the panel of judges in the next, couple weeks. And I'm looking for some advice to try to get them to give us some incentives to lower some of those rates so that we can get these people in the programs and to implement the aftercare for these inmates that are in the system now, and to get them to do the reentry portion aftercare. So I'm looking for some advice, really, from a judge's perspective on.
I don't know that I speak for all judges. I will tell you that judges are not unlike others in the political world. We run in Georgia. We're nonpartisan, but we have to run. I've run several times, most recently last year. Judges are persuaded by facts, in my opinion. You have I think, some divergent views on the trial bench in Georgia that may be able to be, that analysis may be able to be carried forward to Florida, in that Representative Neal, for example, has alluded regularly to the fact that he has a Superior Court judge, chief judge in his circuit in Northwest Georgia, that quite frankly doesn't think he's a social worker and doesn't think he has a role in all of this. And he's entitled to that opinion. I don't begrudge any judge for not wanting to develop a drug court program. I'm a little bit concerned when a judge does so on some pretext that it's because he's not a social worker. Just tell me you don't want to work any harder, and I'll live with it, and we'll move on. I understand that. What I find is that the younger generation judges, some of the younger judges are a little bit more progressive in their thinking with respect to some of these things. I don't think I'm an outlier when I say that aftercare is important, and I think judges know that. Trial court judges that deal with the same people and the same issues in the same exact case over and over and over, except change the name. I think by and large, if they take their job seriously like I did mine, want to make a difference. I think they truly do. And so I would suggest that you start with data. And you start with whatever data you've got that demonstrates that your program, whether it's an MRT program or any of these cognitive behavior programs, and there are a lot of them out there, that they work. Most judges are busy. Most judges do not want to continually deal with the same person on a probation revocation over and over and over again, particularly when their options are extremely limited. I don't know what your options are in Florida, but in Georgia, if you don't have a drug court program, it's prison or probation, or maybe a probation detention center, but you have a sinking feeling when you send somebody to one of those facilities that you know that it's not going to do anything. It's going to house them for a while, but in the end of the day, it will not fix the problem. And I really wanted to fix the problem. And so you've got to find a judge that's amenable. And whether that's somebody you're talking to or not, I don't know. I know some judges in Jacksonville. But I can't tell you. Yeah, I don't know. I've tried to talk to judges around the state and encourage them, and I said this earlier today in one of our conversations. If you have a heart for helping people and you genuinely take your job seriously, whether you're a legislator, it doesn't matter, whether you're a judge, whether you're a prosecutor. I couldn't sleep at night knowing that I had this awesome authority that is invested in your trial court judges in the state of Georgia, and you don't use it in a way other than just continually warehousing folks. And it bothered me such that I started deciding that I would look into the data, and the data drove me to where I ended up, which was the development of a drug court program. It's not the be-all, end-all, and in the end of the day, it won't work for everybody. There are other things that judges can do. Be actively involved in these sorts of programs that develop good public policy for the state and have input. And we have some good judges in Georgia that are very progressive in their thinking, and I suspect you do in Florida as well, and ultimately just let the data drive the conversation. I hope that helped. Thank you.
Give this distinguished panel another round of applause. Again, I want to thank FSU's Project on Accountable Justice and St. Pete College, Sandy D. Allenbert for coming out here, my staff, Valerie Wickbolt and Scott Scholl, for all their hard work and what they've done. And I'd like to ask David Clement from the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions at St. Pete College to come forward and say a few comments.
Thank you, Dr. McClure and panel. It has been a great program. I feel like we probably could go longer, but we do want to respect your time. I'd like to recognize the panel and the moderator again, if you would, please. And while we're recognizing, I'd like to recognize the few people who made this program possible. You heard from her right in the beginning, and them, Deborah Brodsky and Allison DeFore of the Project on Accountable Justice, my colleague at St. Petersburg College, Professor Jeff Cronschnabel of the College of Public Policy and Administration, and my staff at the Institute, Jacqueline Schuett and Shante Williams, who, by the way, is a product of this FSU College of Law as a former employee. Thank you to those people. It has been an honor to partner with the James Madison Institute and the Florida Institute of Justice on this project. And this is our third in the series, in case you didn't get that note earlier. We have video of the previous programs on our website, which is spcollege.edu/solutions, and we will have video of this program up in shortly, probably a day or two. Thank you all for coming, and good night, safe trip home.